The Second Battle of Tikrit was a battle in which the Iraqi forces recaptured the city of Tikrit from the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Iraqi forces consisted of the government's security forces and the Popular Mobilization Forces, receiving assistance from Iran's Quds force officers on the ground, and American, British, and French air forces. The city of Tikrit, located in the central part of the Saladin Governorate north of Baghdad and Samarra and lying adjacent to the Tigris River, was lost to ISIL during the huge strides made by the group during its offensive in June 2014. After its capture, ISIL performed its most infamous massacre at Camp Speicher, located near Tikrit. After months of preparation and intelligence gathering, Iraqi forces engaged in offensive operations to fully encircle and subsequently retake the city, starting on the 2nd of March 2015. The offensive is the largest anti-ISIL operation to date, involving some 20,000–30,000 Iraqi forces, with an estimated 13,000 ISIL fighters present. It was reported that 90% of the residents of the city left out of fear, both of ISIL and retaliatory attacks by Shia militias once the city is captured. As such, most of the residents fled to nearby cities, such as Baghdad and Samarra, or even further to Iraqi Kurdistan or Lebanon. On the 4th of April, after several days of heavy fighting and acts of vengeance committed by some Shiite militias, the situation in the city was reported to have been stabilized, and the last pockets of ISIL resistance were eliminated, with an Iraqi police major reporting that the situation now is calm. Quote, however, on the 5th of April, continued resistance by 500 ISIL fighters in the city was reported in several pockets, which persisted for another week as government forces continued combing Tikrit for hiding ISIL fighters, especially in the northern Kardashiyu district. On the 12th of April 2015, Iraqi forces declared that Tikrit was finally free of all ISIL forces, stating that it was safe for residents to return. However, pockets of resistance persisted until the 17th of April, when the last 140 ISIL sleeper agents in the city were killed. Cleanup and defusing operations in the city continued, but Iraqi officials predicted that it would take at least several months to remove the estimated 5,000–10,000 IEDs left behind by ISIL in Tikrit. Background: Tikrit, the hometown of former Sunni dictator Saddam Hussein, fell to ISIL during the offensive in June 2014. A first attempt to recapture the city in late June 2014 was repelled by ISIL after a few days, as well as another Iraqi attempt to recapture the city in July 2014. Subsequent efforts in December 2014 also failed to make headway against ISIL, which consolidated control over Tikrit and its environs. On the morning of the 19th of August 2014, Iraqi government troops and allied militiamen launched a major operation to retake the city of Tikrit from the militants. The military push started early in the morning from the south and southwest of the city. However, by the afternoon, the offensive had been repelled by the insurgents. Additionally, the military lost its positions in the southern area of the city it had captured a few weeks earlier. The operation in Tikrit counted as the first major attempt by both Iraqi military and the Iran-backed Shiite to recapture ground seized by Islamic State group the previous summer. Preparations. In early February 2015, Iraqi forces and their allies began preparations for an attack on Tikrit, with troops arriving in the nearby city of Samarra. The Allied forces were composed of a heterogeneous makeup, including Iraqi security forces, a multitude of Shiite militias which received support, training, and leaders from Iran, and a number of Sunni tribes. Iranian leaders included included officers from the Revolutionary Guard's Extraterritorial Operations Division, the Quds Force, including the commander of the Quds Force, General Qasem Soleimani himself. The Iraqi army and security forces, along with Shia militia groups who call themselves Popular Mobilization Units, were to push into Tikrit from several directions. Some Iranian commanders took part in leading the operation, with General Qasem Soleimani directing operations on the eastern flank from a village about 35 miles from Tikrit called Al-Burayash. The offensive was the biggest military operation in the Salafuddin region since the previous summer, when ISIL fighters killed hundreds of Iraq army soldiers who had abandoned the military base at Camp Speicher outside Tikrit. Soleimani was also spotted at Camp Speicher, where he oversaw elements of the Kataib Imam Ali and the Badr brigades, the Shiite paramilitary groups constituted by far the largest component of the Allied forces at 20,000 fighters, with 3,000 being the total count of the Iraqi security forces and roughly 1,000 Sunni tribesmen making up the rest of the combined army. An advisor to the Iraqi government was quoted as saying that the attackers were divided into an initial assault force of 9,000, with another group made up of local Sunni tribesmen who were to pacify the city, and another group which would work on intelligence gathering, reconstruction work, and dealing with the expected refugee flow caused by the fighting. According to reports from locals, most of the civilian residents had left Tikrit for Kurdistan and Baghdad, leaving mostly ISIL fighters inside the city. The UN estimated that about 28,000 civilians had reached Samarra following the outbreak of the offensive against ISIL. The U.S.-led coalition was not initially a participant in the operation. As the battle commenced, Gen. Martin Dempsey mentioned that, while the U.S.-led coalition had not been directly involved in the offensive, the continuous airstrikes along the length and breadth of ISIL territories in Syria and Iraq had greatly depleted the group's capacity, and that the newest assault against Tikrit would not have been militarily feasible, were it not for the airstrike campaign in the preceding months throughout the country. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs also maintained that Iran's overt role could be positive and could only become problematic if it descended into sectarianism. The offensive encirclement on the 2nd of March 2015, the Iraqi government launched a massive military operation to recapture Tikrit, with 20,000–30,000 Allied fighters, backed by aircraft, besieging the city on three fronts. On the 3rd of March, the Iraqi security forces, in cooperation with local tribes and militias, captured the strategic oil fields of Alasa and Ajil in eastern Tikrit, after the ISIL militants were relentlessly bombarded by a barrage of artillery shells and gunfire from the east. Due to the withdrawal from the Alasa and Ajil oil fields, ISIL was forced to withdraw towards one of the last strongholds at the town of Al-Alam, where ISIL was expected to prepare its last stand against the Iraqi army and its allies in the northern sector of the conflict. Al-Alam was the last land bridge left for ISIL's communications with the rest of its territories in the province, and if it was cut, it would result in their encirclement. Continuing their offensive, the ISF took complete control of the highway between Tuzkumato and Tikrit, raising the Iraqi flag at the police headquarters in the town of Ksayba following the fierce clashes with ISIL combatants. East of Tikrit, the ISF and their allies captured the Hamran Mountains, killing a number of militants in the process. According to Iraqi media source Haidar Sumeri, 4 suicide bombers were killed during the battle, including a female identified among the dead militants. intelligence. The high number of IEDs ISIL planted along the possible routes of advance towards Tikrit necessitated that the Allied commanders operate with diligence and caution. Another factor contributing to the slowed advance of the Allied forces was the large number of ISIS snipers present. On the 5th of March, Islamic State militants set fire to oil wells in the Agil field, in an attempt to hinder airstrikes against the positions. According to military sources, the Allied forces had retaken the village of Al-Mabdi, on the road between Tikrit and Kirkuk, as well as the nearby Agil and Alas oil fields. On the 7th of March, the strategic town of Al-Dur, located south of Tikrit, was captured from ISIS and secured, allowing the Allies to progress further northward, in support of other contingents on the east bank of the Tigris River, towards Tikrit itself. On the 9th of March, the Allied forces rapidly advanced on and captured the town of Al-Alam, which lies to the northeast of Tikrit and was the last line of communication ISIS militants had left with the territories to the north. The successful assault on Al-Alam, which was commanded by Hadi al-Ameri under the advice of Qasem Soleimani, effectively completed the encirclement of ISIL in and around Tikrit. Despite ISIS' efforts to forestall the rapid advance of the Allies on the east bank of the Tigris River, by blowing up the bridge leading to the city, the Allies managed to mount a push across the river and establish a bridgehead, though other sources reported that the destruction of the bridge momentarily held up the advance in this sector, with a source saying that ISIS jihadists blew up a vital bridge over the Tigris River, which may delay the progress operations in the eastern parts of Tikrit. Quote, ISIS had been suffering heavy casualties, with reports of their dead littering the streets, with only 2,000–3,000 militants left to make a last stand in the city itself. Also, at this time, ISIS hung dead bodies at the entrance to the northern town of Hawiyah, which were those of militants who deserted from Tikrit. According to Al-Ray's chief correspondent Elijah J. Magna, still, ISIL reinforcements were being sent to Tikrit from other parts of Iraq. Push into the city. The ground assault on the city itself started on the 11th of March, and by the next day, approximately three-quarters of Tikrit was in Allied hands, according to government officials, while the rest remained under ISIS control, with only a few hundred remaining ISIS militants reportedly holding out in defending the center of Tikrit. Under these circumstances, ISIS reportedly resorted to the use of chlorine gas against the Allied combatants. On the 13th of March, it was revealed that ISIS was still in control of around half of the city, while the ground offensive had stalled. Meanwhile, it was reported that Shiite militia fighters and Iraqi government troops were torturing and conducting revenge killings of captured ISIS prisoners. Allegedly, captured militants were beaten, shot, beheaded, dismembered, and thrown from buildings by Iraqi forces, with the remains mutilated and photographs posted online. Among the pictures posted on pro-Shiite and Iraqi forums and on Instagram were images of beheaded ISIS fighters, while other images showed militants shot and dragged behind trucks and thrown from high buildings. According to reports, the killings were revenge for similar ISIS atrocities, especially the Camp Speicher massacre of June 2014. In response to the allegations, the Iraqi army promised an investigation. By the 14th of March, the number of ISIL militants holed up in the center of Tikrit had been reduced to around 1,000, with Iraqi commanders claiming to be able to purge the city entirely of the enemy within a matter of days, in a slow and methodical approach to minimize casualties from the plethora of IEDs and AMP booby traps traps placed by ISIL in the urban area. A temporary halt to the advance was made in order to bring up specialists as well as elite troops with more urban warfare experience for the final push into the city center held by the remaining ISIL militants. There was a reported surge of material reinforcements for the Allied forces during the later stages of the operation, with a myriad of Iranian-made weaponry making it to the front line. These were said to include tanks, rocket systems, combat vehicles, and even UAVs, as U.S. officials told the New York Times that Iran sent drones toward Tikrit, and Iran's state-owned Fars news agency claimed that unmanned vehicles were airborne over the city. In the period between 10 and the 15th of March, more than 200 mortar rounds had been launched into the Qadisiyah district by the Allied forces. On the 16th of March, various news outlets reported on the destruction of Saddam Hussein's tomb in his ancestral village of Al-Awya. Allied soldiers stated that ISIL had planted IEDs throughout the mausoleum and booby-trapped the entire complex in an attempt to ambush the attackers. The building was completely leveled and only the pillars remain. After Iraqi forces took the control of Al-Awya, Shiite militiamen of the Popular Mobilization Committee placed the Shiite militia's insignia around the village, including that of the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, the commander, and also a veteran of the Iran-Iraq war waged by Saddam Hussein. Offensive stall. Casualties mounted during urban warfare in the tight city streets of central Tikrit, where ISIL planted such a great magnitude of bombs and prepared a very strong defense at the heart of the city. Due to the unexpected resistance, there were reports of mounting casualties sustained by the Allied side, who called up the specialist forces to engage in urban warfare in the city center. One of the commanders of the ASAIB al-Haq militia stated that the battle to retake Tikrit will be difficult because of the preparations made. They planted bombs on all the streets, buildings, bridges, everything. For this reason, our forces were stopped by these defensive preparations. We need forces trained in urban warfare to break in. But any besieged person fights fiercely. Quote, in downtown Tikrit alone, there was a reported total of some 6,500 IEDs. On the 17th of March, the Allied reinforcements started to arrive at Tikrit, and there were also signs that civilians were returning to the recaptured outskirts, such as Al-Alam. On the 19th of March, a U.S. official said that due to the fierce resistance from surviving ISIL forces in the city center, the recapture of Tikrit was at least 2 weeks away. On the 23rd of March, Iraqi security forces discovered an underground tunnel connecting Al-Alam to the central part of the city of Tikrit, which was used by ISIL. Coalition airstrikes, partial militia withdrawal. In return for air support, the United States demanded that the Iranian-led Shiite militias withdraw from the battle. The Iraqi government agreed, though the militia commanders objected and said they would boycott the fight. This had the effect of clearing the way for U.S. involvement and liberation of the city. There were reports from the ground that the disengagement of the militias was incomplete. On the 25th of March, the Allied forces were supposed to resume their offensive as the American-led coalition launched its first air strikes on ISIL targets in Tikrit. At night, U.S. aircraft carried out 17 airstrikes in the center of Tikrit, which struck an ISIL building, 2 bridges, 3 checkpoints, 2 staging areas, 2 berms, a roadblock, and a command and control facility. However, the ground assault was pushed back by 2 days, due to disagreements between the various components of pro-government forces. The Allied ground troops had mixed reactions towards the participation of the United States in the closing phase of the battle. A spokesman for ISIL al-Haq said, "We announced that we will suspend our operations as we won't accept the Iraqi government giving the victory to the Americans on a golden plate. There is no need for the American airstrikes now as we have already liberated 90% of Tikrit. We won't let the Americans take the glory for the work they are doing for liberating 10%. Quote. However, the most senior commander among the paramilitary groups, Hadi al-Ameri, said that, "From what I understand, Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi made the request. However, we respect his decision." The number of remaining ISIL fighters, who continued to control 40% of the city, was estimated at 500 to 750 heavily armed combatants. On the 26th of March, RAF Tornado GR-4S, supported by a Voyager tanker, used Paveway IV laser-guided bombs to attack 3 ISIL strongholds in Tikrit. On the 27th of March, the Shiite militias, with the exception of the Badr organization, pulled out of the Battle of Tikrit. On the 28th of March, the US-led coalition conducted 8 airstrikes in and near Tikrit, hitting 2 large ISIL units, 1 tactical unit, a vehicle-borne explosive device and 12 fighting positions. Overall, the previous 3 days of coalition airstrikes had been described as carpet bombing. Ground fighting itself was inconclusive, with back-and-forth fighting occurring where the same territory was changing hands every half an hour. The regular government troops were in no rush to capture the center of Tikrit, especially since they felt disappointed and in need of changing their plans after the paramilitary forces withdrew from the battle. On the 29th of March, an attempt by the Iraqi army to advance from the southern Shashin district was repelled when ISIL fighters destroyed a bulldozer being used by the military to clear a path around booby-trapped roads. Between 26 and the 29th of March, 17 soldiers were killed and 100 were wounded in the street fighting. An RAF Tornado GR-4 patrol provided close air support to Iraqi forces near Tikrit. A brimstone missile was used to destroy an ISIL armored personnel carrier positioned under a road bridge. Battle for the city center. On the 31st of March, Iraqi security forces established fire control over the city. Soon afterwards, Iraqi security forces advanced into the city center, seizing the Saladin provincial government headquarters and the Tikrit hospital. As they moved towards the presidential complex, the ISF and the Hashid al-Sha'abi militia forces also captured the central prison and the civil defense directorate. Soon after government troops reached the city center, the Iraqi prime minister declared the city to be captured. The Iraqi forces have entered downtown Tikrit before a short time and have raised the Iraqi flag on its provincial government building, Abadi said in a press conference in Baghdad. Large parts of the province have been under his control since June 2014, after bloody clashes broke out between Iraqi security forces and the group. However, U.S. military officials expressed skepticism that the battle was over. By the end of the day, ISIL resistance still remained. The final stage of the assault was conducted by some 4,000 ISF in conjunction with approximately 10,000 Shiite paramilitaries under nominal command of the ISF. At that time, it was also estimated that only 400 ISIL fighters remained inside the city. On the 1st of April 2015, it was reported that 150 ISIL fighters had been killed, reducing the number of ISIL in the city to around 250. Late on the 1st of April, Iraqi security forces reported that they had captured 95% of Tikrit. with only around 30 ISIL fighters reportedly left hiding inside of some houses in the northern parts of the city. They also stated that they expected the battle to end in the coming hours. Meanwhile, Iraqi forces continued dismantling IEDs and other booby traps left behind by ISIL in the city. However, an Iraqi military official in Tikrit stated they had only taken about half of the city. By the 2nd of April, Iraqi forces had taken more parts of Tikrit, including Saddam Hussein's presidential palace. 3 ISIL senior leaders were reported to have been killed in the presidential palace. However, heavy resistance from isolated ISIL pockets was still reported in the northern neighborhoods of Qadisiyah and Alam, where a few hundred ISIL fighters were still present. Also, it was believed that after Tikrit had been fully secured, the Iraqi forces would redeploy to Beiji, to clear the ISIL from that city and the surrounding region, which an Iraqi official later confirmed on the 3rd of April. Clearing the city on the 3rd of April, Iraqi forces continued combating ISIL fighters. Shiite militia leader Hadi al-Amiri stated that after the Saladin Governorate was liberated, the next target would be the Anbar Governorate, before finally going on to Mosul. Beginning on the 1st of April, Shiite militias entered the city, with multiple fighters burning buildings, looting, vandalizing, and mobbing and killing ISIL POWs, and sometimes mutilating the corpses. In one instance, a foreign ISIL fighter captured by the militias was stabbed to death and then hung from a streetlight, while local forces stood by and witnessed the lynching. Acts like these prompted Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi to order the arrest of anyone caught looting or vandalizing. On the 3rd of April. On the 4th of April, 80% of the Shiite militias pulled out of Tikrit, in response to complaints by locals that some of the fighters had spent several days looting the Sunni city, after helping retake it from ISIL. Other reports indicate that looting and deliberate burning of houses and shops was a result of conflict between Sunni groups which opposed, and those which supported ISIL. By the 4th of April, the battle had left Tikrit largely deserted and in ruins, with an Iraqi police major saying, "The situation now is calm," and Iraqi Captain Mahmoud al-Sad reporting, "There are no resistance pockets inside Tikrit." However, on the 5th of April, it was reported that 500 ISIL fighters were still holed up in the northern Qadisiyah district. On the same day, 12 ISIL militants were killed on the outskirts of Tikrit. Fighting continued through the next several days, with Brigadier General Thamer al-Hamdani, the director of the anti-explosives department in Tikrit, being killed when a booby-trapped house exploded in Qadisiyah on the 7th of April. Throughout 7 and the 8th of April, 79 ISIL militants were reportedly killed in Tikrit, with Iraqi forces also suffering some casualties. On 10 and the 11th of April, Iraqi security forces continued combing through the last pockets of ISIL resistance in Tikrit. On the 12th of April, the Iraqi government declared the city free of ISIL forces, stating that it was safe for residents to return home. However, many refugees from Tikrit still feared returning to the city. On the same day, Abu Maria, the ISIL leader of the parts of the Saladin Governorate stretching from Al-Hajjaj to Al-Butima, was killed by Iraqi forces near the Ajal oil field to the northeast of Tikrit. It was revealed that he was killed with his top aide while fleeing from the city of Tikrit, despite the Iraqi government declaring that was Tikrit free of ISIL. ISIL militants continued to hide in the city, until the remaining 140 ISIL sleeper agents were located and killed by Iraqi security forces on the 17th of April. Aftermath. On the 8th of April 2015, Iraqi government forces built on their advances in the area around Tikrit and launched an offensive to liberate the Anbar province from ISIL. ISIL. As a result of the Iraqi offensive, ISIL launched a counterattack in the region, capturing 3 villages to the east of Ramadi on 15 April. Following the end of the battle, clean-up and defusing operations continued in Tikrit. However, Iraqi officials predicted that it would take several months to fully identify and remove all of the 5,000–10,000 IEDs that had been left behind by ISIL in the city. After the clearing and demining operations by the Iraqi army and militias, over 50% of the former inhabitants of the city of Tikrit returned, according to a statement by an Iraqi official. Other towns around Tikrit have also seen large numbers of displaced civilians returning. Al-Alam saw 90% of its population returned by mid-September 2015.